Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the ICRC. It's great to have you with us in the room, but also to have so many people following the live stream. So thank you for being with us today. I'm Hugo Slim, Head of Policy at the ICRC here in Geneva, and it's a great pleasure to host this event with the Humanitarian Policy Group from London. And the event is on dignity in displacement, and we are really launching tonight and discussing HPG's research and report on dignity and humanitarian action in displacement. You'll find copies outside if you're here, and lots of copies online if you're watching live stream. And there are several reports on the question of dignity, which HPG have been working on for 2 years. I'm actually really excited about this report, and I was reading it, and I was thinking, and I've been in humanitarian action for some time now, that this is really one of the most exciting reports I've read over the last few years. And the reason it's exciting, I think, is because it takes a fundamental humanitarian value, a fundamental humanitarian goal of human dignity, and it makes it practical. It grounds it, so it's sort of grounded philosophy, which to me is very exciting, and I think for anyone involved in humanitarian work is incredibly important. Dignity for the ICRC and for all humanitarian actors is a fundamental goal of what we try and do. It's at the very heart of our first principle of humanity, which is to protect life and health and to ensure respect for the human being. And it's really that last bit, ensure respect for the human being, that is a recognition of people's dignity and the importance of honoring that dignity. And I think we all know, as human beings, we all know, each one of us in this room, each one of us watching live stream, we all know what it is like to feel humiliated, to feel degraded, to feel disregarded and unseen. And that affects our dignity. But on the other hand, I think we all know as well what it feels like to be valued, to be treated equally with one another, to be heard, to be really seen, and to be loved as a person. And that involves respect and honoring the other's dignity. I think the other extraordinary thing we know as humanitarian workers, and we all know in our human lives from seeing people in distress, we all know that sometimes, no matter how much someone is suffering, no matter how badly they're being treated, no matter how bad their conditions are, it is extraordinary how people can show immense dignity in suffering. So dignity is a really important principle in humanitarian work. It's a really important starting point, and it's a really important humanitarian goal. And that is why I'm so excited about this report, about this work by HPG, because they have listened to people in several countries and asked them what it means to be treated in a dignified way when you are displaced, when your world is turned upside down, when you have left your home, lost family members, been attacked and hurt and impoverished. What does it mean to be treated with dignity? And so I'm delighted to launch this with the HPG here in Geneva, and delighted this evening to have Kerry Holloway, who's the author of the report, with others at HPG, to start us off with a quick summary of the report so we all get up to speed. Then we'll move up and have a panel discussion here, and I'll introduce the panelists to you then. We'll come to the floor as soon as possible and have questions and answers. And then we'll have an apéro outside afterwards, because we want to try and treat you with some dignity, those of you that are here with us at the ICRC. So Kerry, please come up, and congratulations on a great report, and tell us what's in it.
So thank you, Hugo, and thank you to the ICRC for having us here tonight. As Hugo said, this report that we're launching tonight is the final output of a 2-year study that we've been doing at the Humanitarian Policy Group with the Overseas Development Institute in London, looking at dignity and displacement. And over the next 10 minutes, I'll talk through some of the key findings and briefly go through the recommendations that we make at the end of this research. I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you have, but I do encourage you to read this, and then if you're interested in more, there's a couple of outputs that have really gone into this research that you can read as well that hopefully will answer more of your questions than I might have time to do tonight. So hopefully this works. Oh goodness, I think it's not on. Yeah. So the Dignity and Displacement Project set out to get humanitarian actors thinking about how they use the concept of dignity and how they can engage with it more constructively. So when designing the project, we discussed how dignity is an off-cited yet ill-defined concept in current international discourse and in the humanitarian sector. Very few people have actually tried to define the word dignity, and even less from the point of view of affected people. So this was our starting point. We wanted to explore how affected people conceptualize dignity and their perception of whether the humanitarian response to their displacement was either upholding or undermining that dignity. So we tested two assumptions. The first was that when the humanitarian community and the affected people have a very similar idea of dignity, that then the response would be more dignified. And then the second assumption goes to the localization debate. So we wanted to know whether local actors had a better understanding of dignity than international ones. The goal of the project was not to define dignity. Even if a concrete definition could be agreed, its meaning and application would be so dependent on the context that a single definition seemed unhelpful. Instead, the project tried to provide better understanding of what dignity meant to an affected, a displaced population at a certain time, a certain place, in order to inform a more dignified response. So as I was saying, there are four main outputs that have gone into this final report. We started off with a literature review, looking at how dignity has been conceptualized both historically and within the humanitarian sector. Then we put out a series of 4 mini case studies, which were about 4,000-word studies done by local actors in Afghanistan, Philippines, South Sudan, and Colombia. And finally, there were 2 longer case studies looking at the Rohingya in Bangladesh and Syrians in Lebanon. And there are a few copies of these earlier outputs outside if you are interested in any of these. So if you're quick, you might be able to get one. So based on these outputs, I'd like to talk you through the 3 main findings of the report. First, understandings of dignity are contextually and culturally specific. Dignity is not inherently understood. It's an umbrella term that incorporates many aspects of what communities value most. 2 of the main themes that were commonly articulated across the case studies for the project were respect and self-reliance. But other ideas differed. For the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and for returnees, IDPs, and refugees in Afghanistan, it also included religion, particularly when it related to purdah for women. So in both of these examples, purdah has 2 forms. The first is women who cover themselves from the gaze of men who are not their family members, and the second is gender segregation, which is also often achieved by women staying home most of the day. For Syrian and Lebanon, it also included rights. Here, their most fundamental rights are dependent upon having papers, and because they're not citizens of Lebanon or even recognized refugees, they feel like this really impinges on their dignity. For IDPs in Colombia, it was also about justice and truth. There, dignity is seen as being able to claim IDP status and receive the rights due them, or their justice, and to be seen as IDPs and victims, as there's a strong belief that those who are internally displaced must have done something or brought it upon themselves. For IDPs in the Philippines, it was about honor and pride. Their IDPs are almost always home-based, as only the most destitute or those without family members to take them in would be living in collective shelters, as it would be an affront to family honor otherwise. So let's deep dive into just one of these areas, self-reliance. The importance of self-reliance for the concept of dignity throws up difficult questions for the humanitarian community. The very reason humanitarian aid is needed is because people can't provide for themselves. When we were in Bangladesh, many Rohingya told us that the moment they felt most dignified and the moment they felt least dignified was the exact same, when they crossed the border into Bangladesh and were met by local Bangladeshis who gave them kindness and hospitality, who recognized their struggle and provided them with the assistance they desperately needed. But this was also when they realized that they no longer were able to be self-reliant or to provide for their families. Thus, receiving emergency assistance can give some dignity, but it also reminds people of their loss of dignity. So this leads me to the outcome of our first assumption. Understanding how the displaced people conceptualize dignity did not necessarily guarantee a more dignified response, and this is largely due to external constraints. But we do think that this is a good place to start. In Lebanon, humanitarian actors and displaced Syrians conceptualize dignity similarly, focusing on rights, respect, and independence. Yet the interviewed Syrians, and even the interviewed aid workers, overwhelmingly did not think that that response is currently very dignified. In Bangladesh, humanitarian actors conceptualized dignity differently than the Rohingya. They focused on the humanitarian sector's presence and humanitarian buzzwords such as meeting basic needs, communication, protection, and agency. Yet the interviewed Rohingya overwhelmingly felt the response did prioritize their dignity. In Colombia, there's official acknowledgement at an institutional level that people have lost dignity, but people remain feeling undignified even with this recognition. In each of these situations, external constraints and conditions, such as the loss of rights in Lebanon, the end of persecution in Bangladesh, and the ongoing stigmatization in Colombia, also contribute to this contextual grounding of dignity. So the second main finding of the case studies is that dignity can be an individual concept, a social concept, or both. For the Rohingya, dignity was overwhelmingly a social concept, whereas for Syrians in Lebanon, it was mostly individual, and for IDPs in the Philippines, it was equally individual and social. Understanding both the individual and social aspects of dignity is important because as humanitarians, we tend to think only on an individual level, or whether each individual person has enough to meet their basic needs. But the case studies demonstrate that it's also important to think about dignity on a communal level, particularly around targeting, but also around cultural norms and the wider societal implications of how aid is given. So this leads on to the third point. Dignity for the affected people didn't seem to really be about what aid was given, but rather how aid was given. All of the case studies highlighted how undignified they felt to wait in queues to receive aid. And in South Sudan, this case study really highlighted how women felt very humiliated when they had to receive dignity kits whilst waiting in the same queue with men to receive food aid. Interviewees in Bangladesh, Lebanon, and the Philippines said that maybe home-delivered aid would be a more dignified way to do about this. Many case studies also highlighted the importance of the style of communication. Displaced people in Afghanistan, Colombia, and Bangladesh talked about this mostly in the idea of mutual respect and kindness, particularly in their interactions with aid workers. In Lebanon, the Syrians mostly talked about it in terms of face-to-face communication, and this was largely in part of, in light of a decision recently made by UNHCR to start using text messaging to tell people when they were going to start receiving and stop receiving aid, which they felt was highly undignified. The importance of fairness and openness around targeting criteria was also key in all case studies. If aid is only given to some members of the affected community, and it's not clear why, this was universally seen as undignified. That's not to say, however, that the type of aid that's delivered is unimportant. In many of the case studies, interviewees gave examples of culturally insensitive goods that were described as impinging on their dignity. So this included examples of pork products and inappropriate clothing that was given in Muslim contexts like the Philippines and Bangladesh. And in Afghanistan, poorly designed temporary shelters were also cited as an affront to dignity. Here, people were given shelters made of iron in the city of Jalalabad, where in summer the temperature reaches 40 to 45 degrees, and it's impossible to stay in them when their culture actually says that women should try to stay inside the home. So, to go back to the second assumption that we tested, the hypothesis that a more locally led response would result in a more dignified response was problematic for both in-depth case studies. In both Bangladesh and Lebanon, people could rarely distinguish between local and international actors, nor did they think that that distinction was particularly relevant, as they were more concerned about their needs being met than who is meeting their needs. In both case studies, local Bangladeshi and Lebanese organizations are not necessarily local to the Rohingya and the Syrians, and tensions with the host community played a large role. Even when this tension was less, so in the IDP study in Colombia, there were still pros and cons of both types of organization depending on the context. So, what does this mean for humanitarian actors? First, genuine listening and face-to-face communication remains key. People want to be heard, rather than ask extractive questions about things that are predetermined by humanitarians to be important. recent trends of using latest technology to improve efficiency of a response can also come at a cost of undermining people's dignity. Second, the local culture and language must be understood, and humanitarian agencies should involve experts such as anthropologists, sociologists, translators, and others in the response to help understand the population and the particular dynamics of their situation. Third, in order to address the disconnect between aid and dignity as self-reliance, livelihoods programs should be invested in where possible, and more participation in project design and implementation encouraged where not, so in countries that have restrictions on access to labor market, for example. Fourth, there needs to be more complementarity between local and international organizations, so that each type of organization's strengths can be harnessed to reach better humanitarian outcomes for affected people. And finally, dignity is likely not something that humanitarians can deliver, and certainly not on their own. Rather than promise to uphold someone's dignity, it may be more appropriate and honest to openly discuss the limitations of a humanitarian response and link with others in the development, advocacy, and peace-building sectors to address external constraints where possible. So, there you have it, the results of our 2-year study on dignity and displacement. I look forward to answering any questions you may have, but I think we might now turn it back over to Hugo for a panel discussion on the recommendations.
Kerry, thank you. Just stay here for a moment, and then if there's any clarification questions on sort of method. Detail? No? Let's keep going then. Kerry, thank you so much for that. That's great. So if the panel would like to come up, do come up and we can discuss it. I'm going to sit here. Rahima, why don't you come here? And Christian over there. Yeah, great. And have you all got your mics on?
Yes.
Yes, good. So, you've got a little thing saying who the panel is, but we've got Rahima Begum from Restless Beings. She co-founded this NGO in London, but it works all over the world, and you were very involved in the study in Bangladesh with communities from Rakhine State and Myanmar. Brilliant. Christina Bennett from ODI in London, who's the head of the Humanitarian Policy Group, and so who conceived and led the research over all. And then Christian Friis-Bach, who is the Secretary General of Danish Refugee Council. So thank you all very much for coming, and I'm going to start with you, Christian, because dignity is in your mission statement as Danish Refugee Council. So please explain to us what role can and should dignity play in an organization like Danish Refugee Council?
Thank you very much, Hugo, and thank you for inviting me. And let me thank Kerry and Christina and the entire team for this research. I think it's a fantastic report, and I really encourage you all to read it. I enjoyed every bit and piece of it, and I think it's absolutely essential to how we understand ourselves as humanitarians and how we work. And so when Hugo asked me actually to come down and to an event on dignity, I said yes immediately. I had another obligation which I cancelled because I wanted to come and not to speak as much, but to listen and to learn. And I already learned a lot from reading and listening in. And I think it's absolutely essential. It is in our vision statement, a dignified life for all displaced. But that's not the main reason for why I said yes. I said yes because last summer I read a book by a philosopher. I'm an agronomist, I would say, as a caveat, farm boy. I'm not a philosopher at all, but I read a book by a philosopher last summer and about the foundation we stand upon as a society. And the first foundation that he identifies is dignity. And if I'm to say one small thing critical about the report, it is that I do not agree that it's an ill-defined concept or in many ways unclear. And actually, I do not agree either that you can lose your dignity. I don't agree that you should treat people with dignity. Because dignity, for me, is something that every human being has inside of you. The human dignity is something inherent to a human being, and you cannot take it away. And when Article number 1 of the Human Rights Declaration say that we are all free and equal in dignity and rights, it's exactly because we have equal amounts of dignity inside of us. You can't differ and say you have less dignity, you have more. It's something that's inherent to us as human beings.
So if it's inherent, how do you work with it as...
And that's where the report gives us good advice, because it's because of human dignity that you must treat everybody with respect. And it's because of human dignity that you cannot torture people or treat them as slaves, or the human dignity is exactly why you cannot torture or sell or use people as slaves. And it's because of human dignity that we can assign human rights to a human being. If there were no human dignity inside a human being, we could treat them as we wished. But because of the human dignity, the equal human dignity within each and every individual, we can assign them with human rights.
I'm going to press you just once on that, Christian, because how do you do that then in Danish refugee council programming?
The report here is unique in giving us good advice on how we can do it. Because we have to treat everybody with respect because of human dignity within of you, in each and every person. And that's about allowing them, giving them a voice, allowing them to participate, allowing them to meet them face to face, and allowing them to influence the response that we are trying to give as a humanitarian actor. If you read the ALNAP, the State of the Humanitarian System report that we just launched in Copenhagen, and it's also quoted, you were fast in quoting it in here as well. It says that the people who were consulted or able to give feedback about a program were more than 3 times as likely to say that they had been treated with respect and recognizing their dignity. And so that's a major part of it. Secondly, give people means by which they can fight for their own rights. There's a lot of good advice here. Self-reliance, is part of it. But also, and we are quoted, the Danish Refugee Council, one place in the report, because of our work on legal aid, giving means of identification, giving people mechanisms by which they can fight for their own rights. That's really treating programming in a way where we recognize the inherent dignity of the person. I remember just a small anecdote.
Then I'm going to move on.
A small anecdote, because this is a human rights-based approach, in my opinion. That's all it comes down to. If you want to recognize the inherent dignity, a human rights-based approach is essential. And I only understand that, I think 10 years ago when I was in Ethiopia, I met a farmer, and he came over to me. We had discussed farming and all that. I'm an agronomist, I went all into that. But then he came over to me in the end and he said, if he could become a member of Dan Church Aid, which was the organization I worked for back then. And I gave a long, incoherent speech about why he couldn't become a member of Dan Church Aid, because it's a Danish organization. And actually, we didn't have members. We had, and he looked at me a little bit, and he said, he just wanted to explain it to me why he asked, because he said, because he had this small membership card of a seeds organization he had joined, and he had figured out when he went to the local mayor and he showed this membership card, then the mayor treated him with respect. And he listened to him. So he wanted now to become member of more organizations because of that. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. That is how you can make giving people an identity means to fight for their own rights, thereby respecting their inherent dignity and allowing them to stand up.
Brilliant. Christian, thank you. So what I've heard there is it's recognition, actually seeing the person, recognizing their identity. I've heard voice, hearing people, what they're saying, listening to people, consultation, and agency. This point that you make in the report about self-reliance and giving people autonomy, enabling environment where they can be autonomous. Rahima, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that comes up a lot in the Bangladesh case study is about culture and custom and religion. And can you just explain a little bit the relationship between culture, religion, dignity, as you heard it from people?
Of course. I mean, religion and dignity is so intertwined, especially in light of the Rohingya. I mean, the fact that they were displaced to begin with is the religious persecution that they faced in Burma. So having come as a displaced community seeking refuge in their host country, Bangladesh, I think one of the first things that they want to be able to do, and one of the things that a lot of the Rohingya that we interviewed last May said through Kerry's work in this project is, that we want to be able to pray our 5 times. The Muslim community, the Rohingya community want to be able to pray there 5 times, be able to go to the mosques inside the camps and have that freedom, because obviously to be able to exercise their faith and do it openly back in Burma was challenged. And so that came as something which, I expected it, but not something that I expected for them to say as such an important part of what it felt to have a dignified existence in the camp. Other things, like Kerry mentioned, a purdah as well for the women. Not just the physical veil, but the ability to make choices about whether they should stay at home, whether they want to go to the camps, distributions, and queue up with men who they deem as strangers, not family members, and actually, get jostled in the queues while they're trying to get their sack of rice. And they said, well, actually, we want to make the choice to not have to do that. In desperate situations we are, but it goes against our ideals of privacy. And the same thing applies with latrines as well. Using latrines with men and saying, well, one of the things that I remember, and Kerry's mentioned this in the report, is one of the women that we interviewed said it's embarrassing. It's just so shameful. I have to queue with my little pot, go to the latrine with men, and everyone in the camp knows I'm going to the bathroom. And and then at the same time I'm queuing up with men who I don't know, and I'm uncomfortable. And then in that moment, they feel like, hang on, I know I'm in refuge here. I know I've already been displaced, and now I feel so uncomfortable about my sheer humanity. And so it's intrinsic, I think.
Could things have been done about that? Because we talk about emergencies and extreme situations, lack of space, problems of organising things.
Yeah.
Were you aware that actually things could have been done differently?
I was, but at the same time, I think in these emergency situations, the Rohingya have been here for 28 years in Bangladesh, in the 1991 arrivals, and then obviously a couple of years ago after the August attacks, we had the influx of the Rohingya coming in 2017. So I think in emergency situations, it's incredibly difficult to be formulaic in how we support the Rohingya. So I think to suddenly say, right, okay, we need, men's toilets and women's toilets here in cramped conditions, the forest's already being cut down, we're trying to make space for 1 million people. It's difficult for humanitarian actors, I think, and I think it would be utopian to think that we would immediately have those things in place. But I think it would be great going forward, knowing that they're here, to anticipate that we can do.
Can I ask you one other thought? Because in my time as a humanitarian worker, one area that's made really good progress is sexual and reproductive health, and particularly rights for women in that respect. There's an interesting thing that Kerry slightly pointed to in the report about things which are called dignity kits for women. But strangely, when they were applied in the field, they were the opposite. Can you just explain that?
Yeah, I think a lot of women felt that when they had to collect the dignity kits, again, as Kerry mentioned earlier, to do that when you're in a queue with men who are collecting rice. Not all charities do that. Some changes have taken place. They felt that was, not dignified. And also just consultation with the Rohingya, actually to find out about their lived experiences. What do they really need? What sanitary products do they really need? Can they use some of these products? Is this something that they're familiar with? And so there's an assumption that humanitarian actors, we all make, which is this dignity kit, everything inside here will be suitable for a said woman. But this said woman might not be used to using half of it, and maybe it has something else that within her culture she uses. So I think through some consultation we could be better equipped at maybe creating things that are more suitable for that community.
We can't always rely on pre-packed dignity.
No, absolutely not. I think maybe producing them after some consultation,
Thank you very much. Christina, I want to move to you. And one of the things that comes out of the report, because it's very interesting about localization, which is a big agenda these days, and it sort of says that most people don't find, being supported and helped by an international or a local agency particularly more dignifying one way or the other. But you do make the report, in the report, the point that complementarity, that actually if local and international work together, you can find more dignified strategies. Can you explain that?
Sure, thank you. And maybe just to set this in the context of the wider research that we were doing. So this Dignity project was part of a larger bit of research that we were doing looking at local humanitarian action, very much inspired by the localization debate, but really we wanted to call it local humanitarian action because we thought we wanted to look at local action in its own right and not as a sort of byproduct of international action. But in any case, in all of the different research projects within this stream, we were looking at whether or not the differences between local and international and which one was better, because everyone always seems to be asking those questions. And I think I was really struck by Kerry and her colleagues' findings that it didn't matter who was giving the aid. It was about how that aid was delivered. And I think that sort of a finding, what that tells me is that this idea of complementarity, this idea that it's about harnessing the strengths of individual organizations and the individuals within those organizations based on the context, based on their positioning, based on what they have the skills to do, what sort of relationship they have with the communities, is what's important. It's not who is local, who is international, but the kind of the joint response based on, you know, a comparative advantage or at least a complementarity that's important. And I don't think that we've really gotten to that yet. And I think in some of the other research that we're doing, this question of complementarity, the way we think of it now, isn't quite, we're not getting to it enough. We don't map local capacity alongside, you know, needs assessments, for example. We don't understand what the relative strengths of local organizations are to be able to have that complementarity. We don't contextualize local. You know, Carrie pointed out in the report that for the Syrians in Lebanon and for the Rohingya in Bangladesh, local organizations weren't actually local to them at all. So in that case, the local international dichotomy doesn't quite work, and that's what we need to be thinking about. Yeah. We have to contextualize what local is. And also it's about how we value capacity or how we value expertise. You know, there's this kind of unsaid approach to humanitarian aid where, you know, things that are scientific, that are evidence-based, that are international because we've been doing it for so long, because we have technical expertise, that is valued more highly than perhaps the ability to engage with communities, the ability to have that kind of knowledge as to what products in a dignity kit would be more contextual or more appropriate. We don't value them in the same way, and I think it's also about recalibrating our sense of value and how we value capacity. So, you know, we need to sort of calibrate or rethink that kind of balance of complementarity in our responses.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Christian, I'm going to come back to you. And, you know, one of the things that come so strongly out of what everyone said today, and it's the sort of key message of the report, really, it's not, you know, what you do, the aid you give, so much as how you do it and how you treat people. And I want to go back, Christian, to this point about, you know, what could be a paradox between self-reliance and actually not being able to support yourself at a particular point. So how does one work in a dignified way when people are dependent on aid, when they need things to be given to them? How do you work in a dignified way to create that self-reliance?
Well, I believe that the report gives us a lot of good advice and a lot of good examples, because as Christina says, it is very interesting to see how it is not what they receive, it is how they receive it. And also there's examples also from the ALNAP report that says, you know, people judge the quality of what they receive 2 to 3 times more favorably if they were asked and were able to give feedback. You know, and so that's a very important point, and that should be built into our response. And there are many good examples of where you can then build self-reliance in a way that supports and respects the dignity of the human being, but also where you can do the opposite. For instance, on cash-based assistance. Cash-based assistance is in the report seen by most respondents as something that respects their dignity and give them self-reliance in a way where they get increased dignity. But I think it's in Colombia where they had the reverse effect, or one of the studies had the reverse effect, because they had to stand in a queue for 12 hours to get the cash. You know, and then you know, it defeats the purpose of a cash-based assistance if the purpose was to give self-reliance and respect the dignity of the person, if you have to stand 12 hours in a queue to get it, you know. So you have to think these things through and do it in a way where you treat people with respect of their time, respect of them as human beings with the dignity, respect.
And one of the things that comes through again is the right to work. And actually, you know, one of the most important things for displaced people is to be able to work, legally to be able to work, and for jobs to be created or for them to be able to find some things. And is that crucial?
Absolutely, and that's why I'm a little bit surprised that you don't mention the Compact on Refugees and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, because this is the best argument in favor of that Compact and everything to do with self-reliance and building livelihoods that we now believe in and can work for based on the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework and all it entails, because that is exactly about the right to be able to work, the right to get an education or to get access to healthcare or get your kids into school. And that builds the self-reliance, and that respects the human dignity of the people. So in a sense, you know, this report is one big kind of advocate in favor of those solutions that we have now tried to move on and support by means of the Compact on Refugees and everything it has in terms of livelihoods and self-reliance.
So what I'm hearing is it's very important to sort of program with dignity in mind. And you know, as we heard about the dignity kit and the cash, you can't assume because you're doing something that it will automatically be dignifying. You've got to look at how it's being delivered, what's in it, etc. Rahima, can I come back to you and ask you, you know, the other thing, and everyone said it, that comes out so strongly is the need to listen to people. And it was very striking, Kerry's point from the report, that at a time when we're all digitally obsessed with digital relationships, one message was that actually people really need face-to-face relationships and that kind of communication.
Yeah.
Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I mean,
and how?
Yeah, I mean, Christian touched on it perfectly in the sense of just being able to have that contact and being, you know, sharing that exchange of respect. One of the things, I mean, we've been working at Restless Beings with the Rohingya for the last 12 years, and with a partnership with Kerry's project and with the ODI, one of the things Kerry outlined for us last year is that please have some group sessions. Obviously have the one-to-one interviews, but have the group sessions. And when we have the group sessions, we have the women together, or the men together, or the mixed groups, or we have the community leaders, the Majis in each of the camps come together. They all said, you know, at the end of going through all the questions, at the end of it, I'd sit there for about 10 minutes, sometimes half an hour, just to watch the exchange. And often at the end, they would come up to me or my team and say, it was really nice to be able to just sit down with you and tell you what we really feel. This process alone is giving us a little bit of dignity, or allowing us to find our dignity again, something that we haven't felt for such a long time. And obviously it's impossible with 1 million people inside a refugee camp for humanitarian agencies to be able to do that with everyone. But just having these moments, I think, really, truly matters. I mean, listening is vital. I mean, recently, I'm not sure if you're aware, there's that decision that Bangladesh government has made to move 23,000 Rohingya families to the island of Bhasanchar. I mean, this island has moved, you know, has changed in shape 8 times in the last 15 years, and probably isn't ready for 23,000 families to move there. But that decision was made without any consultation with the Rohingya. And I think one of the things, and one of the biggest complaints that has arisen, especially recently, especially with this move, which is about to take place in the next month, is that we were not told about this, or no one came and spoke to us, no one listened to us, no one asked us. And I think this is where it's fundamental for us to listen and give that face-to-face contact. That in itself is dignity.
And can we all do that? I was quite struck again by the report saying we need more anthropologists, we need sociologists, we need all these technical talking people crawling all over these places. Is that true, or actually are these basic skills?
Actually, basic skills, yes, that I think we should cultivate within all the organizations that have access and daily contact with these communities. But I think, yes, there is a need for anthropologists. There's a need for grassroots organizations that have daily access, that are working on the ground, that have teams on the ground. And these don't have to be local Cox's Bazar or Chittagong-based organizations, especially in respect of the Rohingya. These could be international bodies. These could be the Rohingya diaspora who have some experience. But yes, there is a need for anthropologists, certainly.
And if there are hundreds of thousands of people, and we can't sit down with all of them, what are, in your view, the basic rules of digital communication and dignity in digital communication?
I think one of the things is to actually decide who is it that is influential within the camps. So actually, there are pools of Majis. These are community leaders that the Rohingya themselves elect within the camps, or a female Majis or a male Majis. And I think having some communication with them, I mean, within our organization, it's through text, it's through WhatsApp. We have WhatsApp groups, through email, through weekly phone calls, sometimes daily phone calls. And some rules have to be in place, you know, best practices, things like, you know, what sort of information is exchanged, you know, protecting the safety and security, ensuring that that person, you know, the communication is dignified as well. You know, it's recorded, it's available, it's accessible by other organizations, those kinds of things, I think. But I think in terms of digital communication, it's a dangerous ground. We have to be really careful how much exposure we have and how we do it and who's having that exposure. So I think it should come with some sort of auditing. And I
think that's going to be a big challenge for us all, how we have dignified ways of working face-to-face, but dignified ways of working face-to-screen as well.
Yes, that's probably the harder bit,
It's going to be tough, yeah. Christina, can I come back to you? Because one of the other things in the report is that people found it sort of, at one level, disregarding and humiliating when humanitarian workers came in and promised things and raised expectations and said, okay, we can do this and whatever. What is this point in the report about honesty, limiting your promises, and being realistic about expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is something that we've debated internally quite a lot, even between me and Carrie, and we disagree on this. So this is an interesting point, and I would respectfully disagree with Kristen, I think, on this. The whole reason why we did this report is because we did feel that dignity was a concept that has been thrown around by people without really understanding it. And when you go back to the philosophers and you go back to the origins of the word, it is defined quite differently by different groups of people at different points in time and across time and tradition. And so, without a sort of common understanding of what dignity is, and maybe we shouldn't be defining it because there is no common understanding, are we over-promising as humanitarians? We promise to uphold dignity, to promote dignity. It's in every mission statement. It's in every, set of objectives. It's part of the principles of the ICRC and the IFRC. There's kind of secondary principles. It's in there. It's embedded. But I do think we need to take a look at ourselves and really be honest about what is it that we can do and what are the limitations of humanitarian response in this. And especially when, Carrie's point that we work at individual level often, but for a lot of people, dignity is about reciprocity and community level dignity, and we don't necessarily operate with community engagement in mind. I think it's about, and Hugo, when you opened up, you said that, one of the principles of the ICRC, or one of the aspirations, is to treat people with dignity. And I think we can do that. I think it's the how we deliver aid. It's the how we engage with people that we can do better as aid organizations and we can succeed as aid organizations. Whether or not we can promise people dignity, I think is going too far. Because if people define dignity as the right to work, for example, the CRF, makes big promises about the right to work. But ultimately, it's the government of Jordan that's going to decide which refugees get the right to work. And in fact, they haven't given anyone the right to work yet. They've given them work permits, which is quite different. So I think we just need to really understand what we can do as humanitarians, what we can get much better at as humanitarians, and then what do we need to be talking to others about, to states, to peace-building actors, to others that can go further than we can in the promotion of dignity. So we can we can start people on the path of self-reliance and dignity. We can deliver aid in a dignified way, and then we have to reach out to others to be able to give people that package of dignity as they define it for themselves. Because if it is inherent within everybody, it's going to be a really complex mixture of elements that they're not going to get from humanitarians alone.
So we can't promise everything, but we can help them, as you've both said, actually, shape the policy and influence the policy environment so that it is more dignified in some ways through right to work, right to land, etc., privacy issues, whatever. I'm going to come to the floor now, and we've got time now for questions. And it'd be lovely to hear. We'll probably take 2 or 3 at a time. There's a simple rule that you don't stand up and say, I've got 3 questions. You're only allowed 1 each at this point. And please say who you are. So who wants to start us off with a question? We've heard lots of ideals about dignity. Are they realistic? Yeah, please say who you are.
Amazing. Okay. So I had a question to the whole panel, to the whole panel in general. In certain contexts, humanitarian access might not be as ideal as humanitarians want it to be, and there might be limitations to how you can deliver aid and with whom you partner to deliver the aid, which might infringe on the dignity of the beneficiaries. How do you balance dignity with the realities and obstacles to access?
Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. Let's take that one. Others? Yes, please. Let's take those 2 there, and then we'll come back to the group. So, Jessica.
My name is Jessica.
Got to say who you are. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I had a question specifically, I think this goes to Carrie maybe, about the Colombian case, where there was this big link to truth and justice, which is very particular from the Latin America. So I wanted to know if the report sheds a light on the link of truth and justice to dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, that's interesting. Yes, please, and the gentleman in front of you. Yeah.
Thank you, and I'm Stefan from the Danish Refugee Council. I will not ask my Secretary General because we have plenty of opportunity to talk ourselves. I wanted to make a brief comment and raise a question related to that. Having been in the field myself, I think a lot when it comes to dignity can be answered by common sense of putting yourself in the shoes of the beneficiaries. When you stand in the refugee camps with the Rohingya and it's 40 degrees hot and there's only one latrine, it doesn't take much of science to figure out that that is not appropriate. Yet I think there's a call to us, especially internationals, to listen more to our national colleagues, to be more cultural sensitive, as you rightfully point out. That, however, brings my question that I'm a bit surprised to hear that you even asked the question. Local versus international actor. I think even working for an international organization, 97% of our employees are national staff. Those who interact with our beneficiaries are overwhelmingly national staff members. So I think rightfully for many beneficiaries, they would not even see this international face of the organization. That is much more a backstage situation. So I'm not very surprised that there's probably for the beneficiaries not such a big difference. On the honesty, I have a comment because I think one of the major challenges, at least I felt in the field, was when we are required to do assessments, and we have to do lots of assessments because we have to submit proposals to donors, and every NGO comes in with their own assessments to figure it out and to have a case and so on and so forth. That creates expectations. I think very few organizations will say we promise something, but it's more an inherent promising. If they're here to assess and to assess and to assess, then I must assume there will be a response at the end of the day. The question, however, is to the famous, Makshi, as you mentioned, the leader in the Rohingya community. Do we not have a concept sometimes where dignified lives and dignified living circumstances are in conflict with each other? Isn't the community leader having a certain understanding that is not necessarily, for example, respecting the women as we would like have it seen in our probably Western setting of dignified life? Where do we find the life here? Is it, do we respect the cultural structure of a society and traditional norms? Or do we go more for the individual one and saying, sorry, you have your right to a dignified life as we think you should be entitled to?
Stefan, thank you.
Stop here. Thank you.
I'm trying to work out how you went round the rule there. I think there were like 3 comments and 3 questions, but it was well played. It was very creative stuff. Good. Listen, let's get to Ashley's question first about realism, because I think this is important. You know, what do we do when the context is constrained and dignity is going to be constrained? Rahima, where is realism in this?
And I think this ties in with the first question about how we can. The balance between how much you can really do. I mean, as humanitarian actors, and I speak just from my experience of running a charity, you're trying to keep people alive, essentially. You know how to provide food, and at the same time, we're doing advocacy work. So there's a fine balance of trying to keep people alive and making sure that in trying to keep them alive, you're making sure that they're receiving some dignity or you're doing it in a dignified manner. So an example is, for example, in the Rohingya camps, when they were collecting, this was a couple of years ago and even last year through the interviews, when they're going to these distribution points, they're collecting their food. Sometimes some of the volunteers or the employees would beat them to try and keep them in control and make sure that the lines are straight. I mean, that's crazy to think that, here are a group of people who are displaced, who are now seeking refuge, who've already gone through so much persecution, trying to get their daily aid and being beaten. I understand the order and ensuring that the chaos is controlled, but I think, again, boils down to what a gentleman said. It's common sense, and it's a few things we can put into place. It will be very difficult. We certainly won't be able to do both and do them perfectly, but I think think we can put a few things as sort of guidelines for every single organization that is working in these camps as essentials that they must do, that they must respect, especially at distribution points, a couple of the gender issues, and maybe just a couple of others. If those things are in place, I think already the community would receive.
But I think in a sense we have to be
positively.
realistic that very
Absolutely.
often people are actually trying their best to find dignity within indignity.
Yes.
Because most situations are undignifying.
Yeah.
The Colombia one, I think that's an interesting question about truth and justice and its relationship to dignity. Does the report look at Colombia?
Yes, the report does look at Colombia.
So what is that question?
I think what the findings from the Columbia study were saying, but I think maybe Carrie should answer that question.
Carrie, do come and grab your mic. Oh, you've got yours. Yeah. Well, whichever you like. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the Columbia study was a study done by a local actor in Colombia who was part of the collected series of 4 studies that you can find out there that we've just released a few weeks ago. And the issue of justice and truth, it's interesting because Colombia, the response to displacement is very government-led in a way that you don't find in other places. And that has a lot to do with how Latin America looks at humanitarianism, but also to do with just the issues that have been plaguing Colombia for years and years. And one of the things that was interesting is that the government gives out letters of dignity, or cartas de dignidad, for people when they've been internally displaced. So like, here is your letter of dignity to say that you've been displaced, that it's not your fault, that you're entitled to all of this assistance. But what we found is that they liked the recognition of that, but at the same time they had this thing of where they wanted things to be called by their true name. So this is where we get the truth from. That they wanted people to understand that they were IDPs because they were displaced, but not because of anything they had done. So there's this idea that if you're displaced, then you must have been supporting one side or the other, that you must have somehow gotten caught up in the violence that's going on, that you're somehow linked, whether you or a family member. And a lot of times it's not like that at all. It's people who are caught up in violence who have to flee, and who could care less about one side or the other probably. And so this is where they're getting at kind of the issues of justice and truth. But I do encourage you to read that whole study if you're interested in Colombia, because it's really good. Can I also just really quickly on the point about the local versus international? Mm-hmm. I'm really glad Rahima mentioned the example of people who were waiting in queues who ended up getting kind of beaten with sticks. There was another set of interviews we did in Nayapara, which Rahima wasn't necessarily a part of, but they were done by Rohingya interviewers because this camp is quite a bit further away than Cox's Bazar. And there, it was even worse. So there was a lot of problems in terms of being called names, being beaten, being asked for bribes. So people had to pay money to get aid. Lots of corruption going on in this camp that had been there for years and years. And it was interesting because people said when the international staff, and obviously they can tell who's international and who is local, so when the international staff was in the camp, everyone behaved perfectly. When the international staff was not in the camp, then the locals, kind of took out their frustrations that come from this issue of host community tension. They took out their frustrations on these people because it's a very poor area. They've had lots of problems with the influx anyways. And I think that, they see these people coming and getting things for free with not having to do anything, not realizing they can't do anything, that they would prefer to work, but they can't. And so they take out these frustrations. But when the internationals are there, they don't. Everything runs smoothly. So they were actually, some of them were saying, we wish more internationals were there and less local. But that's one camp in one context. So that's kind of what we're getting at when we say more complementary.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Christian, although Stefan said he shouldn't address his questions to you, I'm going to. And I'm going to ask you this question about assessments. Because this is realism again. To get money, donor governments require assessments. And often in the report, it comes through that people feel they're having tokenistic engagement with NGO staff who are asking them questions that are their questions, not people's questions. How does one address the challenge of assessment with dignity?
Well, it's about making assessments where you genuinely listen and allow people to engage. Because there is a lot of tick box participation out there, where we go there, we do the things, we ask whatever, and you disappear, and perhaps you never get the feedback, you don't have the interactive dialogue on the response that builds in respect for people's dignity into the process, and I think that is essential to do this. We have actually a person who's working on a PhD on participation with the DRC, yeah. But she's challenging us on this tick box participation. I tell you. And we are doing it often, and that's why the main thing is the interactive dialogue, you know, the feedback and the respect, and I listened and I recognize what you said and I am addressing it and I get back to you on it. And that's also why, you know, in a sense on digital tools, you know, you have to design them in a way where you allow this feedback mechanism, then it works, you know. Many of us know, you know, we go into a restroom and when you leave the restroom you have this thing on the wall with a green button and a yellow button and a red button. And are you satisfied with the cleaning condition on this restroom? And you tick one of them and you feel, oh, that was nice. And I felt this sense I was listened to until somebody told me that these boxes are not connected. You know, it's just a box. You just it gives you a sense. Yeah. But if nobody gets back to you, if you tick the box and say, sorry, we know it wasn't clean and we'll do better next year and whatever, you know, if that's not in, and that is a simplistic way of telling how we should...
So dignity in assessments is really about the way you conduct the assessment in terms of respect, listening, hearing views, but then this feedback.
And the feedback, you know,
you've got to come back later and tell them what happened.
No, we have JIPS here, we host the Joint IDP Profiling Service here. And when they do an assessment, they did an assessment of the Rohingyas in the Sitwe camps. And they make a huge effort, not only doing an assessment, what are the conditions? And there you can say that they don't go to school, their rights are not respected, all of that, the Rohingyas in the Sitwe camps inside of Myanmar. But they make a huge effort of going back and telling about the assessment. And they had screens in the camps, you know, and went there and tried to interactively tell what they found out. And is this a correct picture, you know? And all that is very important.
And Christina, how are you going to do that with this report? Are you going back? Are you all going back and saying, because it's a couple of times that people say, you know, it's interesting, I hope you'll use our words in the report and that sort of thing. How will you do that feedback loop?
The feedback loop with going back
on the research, yeah.
Well, I think, you know, what's fantastic about the way that this all works is that, you know, the conversation doesn't end with the publishing of this report. It actually starts with the publishing of this report. So this launch and the fact that now we've completed this research actually now launches us into a phase of dissemination, of engagement, of talking. And that will include engagement in forums such as these, with aid organizations directly, with local organizations directly. And we go back to Cox's Bazar quite often for different pieces of research. And we're constantly talking to people, aid organizations, affected people, community leaders about what's happening there. And so this now becomes part of our lexicon, part of our research, you know, part of the evidence that we have to be able to go and engage with communities and engage with aid organizations about how we might do better at the things that we aim to do. So this is where our starting point, not our end point.
I'm going to, because Stefan asked so many, I'm just going to do one more for Rahima and then we'll come back to the floor. But Rahima, can I ask you the difficult ethical question, which is about the values clash?
Yeah.
So if people in a certain community feel that some kind of behavior, some sort of way of life is dignified, but actually other people in humanitarian agencies and from different places feel that it's deeply undignified, how does one deal with that clash of values in a dignified way? We're meant to respect culture and custom, but what if it's actually morally difficult culture and custom for us?
It's a tough one. Yeah. I mean, if it was any other community and not a community that was displaced, it would be easy. We would take the moral high ground and probably try and strike a balance. I think when it comes to dealing with a community that is suffering, that is dealing with trauma, that is dealing with all sorts of issues, and they've come with this baggage of all sorts of emotions that they're dealing with. And fundamentally, I mean, we're looking at sort of rape victims. We're looking at people who are suffering from domestic abuse. I mean, some of the Rohingya victims are actually now prone to trafficking, sex trafficking within. I actually physically saw last year a 13-year-old girl get kidnapped in front of me. When it comes to a community like that, I think what has to happen is if we are to support them, and we are here as humanitarian actors to give them, you know, through empathy and compassion, and without getting too sort of airy-fairy, we are here as humanitarian actors to support them, to keep them alive, to ensure that some dignity is in place, to make sure that the system is going so that these people can stay alive wherever they are, that they found refuge. I think at that point we have to take in what is important to them, and maybe put some of our morality and what we think is right to one side, because it is that community that needs to stay alive, not us. It's that community that needs the dignity, and it's that community that has gone through that trauma. So I think that's where, if something that they deem to be dignified for them, and that's within their cultural, religious, whatever it is, within their value system, and I think we need to work around that and negotiate a space that works with us, that we can come forward a little bit, but actually fundamentally achieves what we need to be achieved, and that community is happy. And I think that's where, we have to maybe put aside some of our own values.
If I could just pick up on that very, very quickly, just to say that it is something that we are going to be looking at for the next 2 years in our next research cycle. I think we're very concerned about that question as well, and we're going to be looking at the issue of gender norms and whether crises are opportunities for changing gender norms, and norms according to whom. And so Carrie and others within the HPG team will actually be looking at that question of, are crises opportunities for changing norms, and by whose step?
And then the question comes, how do you mount a dignified challenge to values that are different to yours?
Yes.
Very quickly, because I want to. Have we got more questions? Let's have. We've got a couple. Let's take those.
Take those.
So we've got one at the back, Catherine Loon, and let's have a student question. Come on, Catherine Loon.
And please stand up.
Hi, I'm Catherine Loon-Grayson from the ICRC. Thank you very much for this. I find it absolutely fascinating. I have a question related to what you say on the fact that it's not so much what we distribute or the type of assistance we provide that matters, but the way we provide it. But then you also say that it's essential that we listen to people and engage with people. Now, when we listen and engage with people, they're going to provide us with feedback on what type of support would help them. And from there, I would think that the type of assistance that we provide is quite critical. So I struggle a bit to reconcile those two ideas, as I completely understand that the way we assist is critical, but I would tend to think that how we assist, what type of assistance we provide at the end of the day, is also critical, as it reflects the feedback that we've received from communities. So I'd like to hear you a little more on this.
Okay, you want to take that? Another question? No? Yes, please. Yeah.
Hey, my name is Felicia, and I'm also an associate at the ICRC. My question was just towards your comment that the next phase will also be looking into gender norms, etc. And because you have been conducting this research, like in the context of humanitarian aid, I possibly see like a tension between transforming gender norms in humanitarian aid, because like what is always emphasized by the ICRC is that we should be neutral, etc., and that our mission is actually not transformative. So I would just, like to know how you would reconcile this transformative element with like the humanitarian principles.
Okay, thank you. Christina, take the first one from Catherine Loon about, what as well as how. I mean, it must matter what people are given, because that's what we hear and listen for.
And thank you for making that point. I mean, I think, and Carrie, please come in and correct me if I'm wrong. I think the point was that, the more emphatic point was it didn't matter who was delivering assistance, but how. And I think the what did come into play, but for example, cash assistance versus in-kind assistance, even if people preferred cash, it was how that cash was delivered that became the most important thing. They didn't want to wait in queues, for 12 hours a day, even though that was their preferred method of assistance. So I think it is a mix of the how and the what, but I think the how being ultimately the most important indicator of what is a dignified response. And I think it's important to get that feedback as organizations. I think, though, we as organizations have to be able to absorb that feedback and pivot and change the way that we do things if we are going to take this concept of dignity seriously. And I'm not sure that, for many organizations, we're able to make those pivots in real time in the midst of a response. And I think that's just something that we need to be considering.
That's a good point. Kristin, try the one on gender norms. How much is your business to transform society?
Well, I think first, if I can say a little bit on that, I will say something on that as well, but on Catherine's important question, because I had the same thought, of course, also reading the ALNAP study, that you know, if you ask people, allow them to give feedback, they're more happy about what they get. I would like to understand if that's a controlled experiment where you gave everybody the same and asked some of them, but kept giving the same, because obviously that's not why we are asking them. We are asking them and are allowing them to participate in order to change what we do. So when you allow them to participate, we do give better quality assistance. We do ensure that the restrooms are designed in a way that protect the dignity of women, because we've asked them how should we design this restroom, and then they tell us, and then so obviously they are linked. I think that's for sure. But it does matter. I said, when I left that restroom, I punched the bottom, I felt it was a better restroom until I learned that it was not connected. Now, so if you do involve people, it does matter, because they feel that you respect their dignity. And if I can just allow, also with Christina, we have this discussion on dignity. And I fully agree with you that there's a lot of confusion. I did not understand the concept of dignity until I read this book last summer. And perhaps I still do not understand it fully. And when we wrote down our vision in Danchurch 8, I asked them, why did you write dignity? And they said, oh, somebody said dignity, and we wrote dignity. You know, there was not a big philosophical debate. But I think we are equal in dignity and rights. And it's Immanuel Kant, right? That's where dignity comes from, human dignity. Whatever admits no equivalent and therefore does not have a price has a dignity. And that's why you cannot say technically that we can ensure your dignity, because your dignity is there. You're equal. We have the same dignity. And we cannot either treat people with dignity technically, because it's something we have within us. We can respect people. We can treat them with respect because we acknowledge that we have the same dignity. And that is also back to the local international debate here. Exactly, because what matters is not whether it's a local organization or an international. It matters whether the person you meet respects that you have the same dignity. And there are many examples in the report. We've discussed some of them where in Lebanon they think the Syrians do not have the same dignity. So they do not respect them as equal human beings. And that's where it breaks down. You know, it is, and that's why it's for me important to say this, that we all have the same human dignity, and that is why we should treat
But I'm just going to qualify that a bit, because I think what's interesting here, you're right, there is an essentialist, an absolute dignity in us all. Yeah. But I think it's like humor. There is humor in us all, but if you go around the world, you'll find that, not everyone, no. you'll find there are different forms of humor, and different jokes are funny in different places. Yeah. And that's the exciting thing about this report and this approach, is it's saying, yes, we all have dignity, but it manifests itself differently to different people, what is important. So just on that, but you're dodging the gender norms.
But it comes back to your gender thing, because exactly, women, men, girls, boys, they have the same human dignity, and therefore they should be treated with respect. And that's also why they have exactly the same human rights. And that we should stand firm on.
So does Danish Refugee Council work to change gender norms in its programming?
For sure.
It does.
And we should do it much more, but we do it. I've just been to Yemen, right, where we have, in one of the projects, employed the first, I think, for almost 400 IDP women, the first job ever they had, you know. And it was amazing to hear about the results, you know, when we employed these women, because there we respected their equal dignity, and we gave them the right to self-reliance. And these women had never worked before. They were IDPs in Yemen, the most difficult place on earth, perhaps, to work with gender equality and empowerment. But they felt their dignity was respected. And it was amazing to hear the stories about how they reacted, you know, and some of them, you know, really stood up for it, and they came on Friday, and I want my salary now. And their dignity was respected, and they stood up as human. So for sure we should work with this, but you always have to respect how far you can go, and you have to respect that it took 150 years in Denmark to create democracy, and we still don't have gender equality fully in Denmark. It takes a long time, and there you need to respectfully address issues in a manner where you understand that it will take time. Yeah. But standing firm, we all have an equal amount of human dignity inside of us.
I think we've got that.
And therefore you have the same rights. That's fundamental.
No, I think we agree with that. So, I mean, you were quite clear before, Rahima, that you hold back in a humanitarian situation, and unless it's deeply dysfunctional for the community. But do you see this? Do you see emergencies and moments of crisis as moments of opportunity for social change?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
I think in some situations, I think just to go on from what Christian said, I mean, and possibly, you know, what reports like this, why they're so important, and why this sort of research is so important. I mean, last year, in the midst of carrying out some of the research for Kerry and ODI, some of the things that came up were things like, you know, separate gender cues, you know, the latrines, and we immediately as an organization started to do that. Some of the latrines that we were building were for women separately. In Indonesia a couple of years ago, as an example, when the boatload of Rohingya arrived, we were one of the first organizations to support, and so the women and men were separated into two camps, and so women and children were in one. And one of the problems in one of the female camp was that there were male security guards, and so they were saying, well, actually, no one asked us, and we don't feel comfortable, and there were issues of trafficking taking place. Then we were trying to figure out if any of the security guards were involved, and obviously we found out that they were. We replaced the security guards. They were being given very sweet food, and the Rohingya palate they like spicy food, and so we had some discussion. They were like, they keep giving us sweet food, and we can't stomach this, and so there were discussions about this. And then the women were saying, well, actually, yes, you know, we as Muslim women, we like to do this, and we want a space to be able to pray, and we want to do this. But also, we love being on Instagram, and we also love dressing up, and we want a place to dance and sing, and we want this as well, and we want to be able to do that. They switch off the lights at this time. We want to be able to chill out. And so that's where that sort of access and that sort of time gives us an opportunity to find out more about how the community thinks, not just what they need on an aid level, but maybe socially, where there are ripples of change with the younger generation with so much access to social media, and where maybe as a humanitarian actors we could step in and maybe discuss things like women's rights, or discuss things like young girls' rights, or the exposure that they have to the international community. You know, aid workers like myself that come in, I'm also Muslim, but might live my life very differently to how they might. I mean, in some respects, maybe they might live their lives more conservatively within the Islamic fold as to how I might live my life in the West as a Muslim. And so that sort of engagement then allows me it positions me to possibly have some influence in how they might negotiate their space as displaced communities. So yes, there is. It really depends on how. It's a touchy one.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Is there any last question? In which case, I suggest we move on and have some refreshments in a dignified manner just out here. But before we do, I want to thank you all very much for coming, online and here. And I want to thank Kerry very much, Christian, Christina, and Rahima. And please keep working out what dignity means in humanitarian action. Thank you. Thank you, Rahima. You're brilliant.
Did I answer your last one properly?
Doesn't matter.
You got me there.
No, thank you.